Well, hi folks, got a new video for you here today. If you're like me and your wife announces that she's buying furniture from Restoration Hardware, you immediately begin following the grief curve, typically with anger and denial and acceptance that what you've bought is just a bunch of hot garbage. And the Restoration Hardware crossback chairs are a prime example of the hot garbage that Restoration Hardware makes. So I've come up with a way to make these things usable again. As you can see, and I'm sure if you're watching this, you've probably experienced yourself, these chairs don't last. So I've got a solution to make these things usable again, and I'll take you through it here today. All right, tools for the job. So what we're actually going to be doing is replacing that kind of meshed bottom with just half-inch plywood. So I buy half-inch sanded birch plywood. You can buy the handy panels at Home Depot. As of today, it was $36 for one 2-foot by 4-foot handy panel, or for $50 you could buy the entire thing and just have them cut it down. So I bought a whole 4x8 sheet and had them cut it down. So half-inch birch plywood, some construction adhesive, just your typical caulk just to close up some seams at the end. I found that the Rust-Oleum Satin Black is closest paint match to the original black. You're going to need a router and a router bit to hog out some of the wood in the chair base, drill and drill bit, and a jigsaw in your typical woodworking type sanding supplies and whatnot. All right, so step one for this project is actually to separate this sort of chair base from the rest of the chair. So you've got a number of different bolts and screws in the bottom of this, holding it all to the chair. But I found it easiest is just to take this whole base off of the chair by disassembling the chair. If you're doing multiple chairs, you're gonna wanna keep them together. These do seem to be sort of custom fit, custom built for the respective chair. So go ahead and unbolt these from all of the chairs. Always helps to have a good helper with you. Okay, so once all your screws and bolts are removed, it is a 10mm bolt. To get the bolts out, you can pop all that stuff out. And then there is kind of a notch joint on the front corner of this. So you might need to use a hammer and hit up from the bottom to separate the bottom of the chair. So one thing you will notice is that I left these little side, corner brace pieces in here. That's on purpose. That's because we're ultimately going to be using a router on the top and we need those dug out. So I leave those screws in, and then with the exception of that error right there, I also leave the little corner kind of reinforcement pieces screwed in to the side of the chair. So this is what we ultimately want to get to, and we'll start working on this. Okay, next up, grab your drill, 1/8" drill bit, and the whole purpose of this step is just to remove all of this webbing stuff from all over the place. So there's holes drilled all the way around this. This is kind of a tedious process, but what I do is to take an 1/8" drill and you drill through each one of those holes all the way clean through to the other side. That breaks up all of this webbed stuff and makes it so that you've got a nice workpiece to then begin routering on. Okay, next step, now that your seating surface is all cleaned up, this is now seating side up. So you would be sitting here. I was incorrect before. These corner pieces don't need to be there, so you can get rid of those. Those are no more. Clamp your workpiece down, and then with a router and a straight cut bit, set the depth to a 1/2" cut. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut a 1/2" groove all the way around this seating surface so that then we can sit a 1/2" piece of plywood into it. With a 1/2" groove routed in now, what you can do is take a piece of paper, any large paper that you've got, and we're going to make a transfer template. So I cut it out, taped it to the top, and then simply take a utility knife. You can even use your fingernail and go around and cut out a transfer template for the piece of wood that then we're going to jigsaw out of the plywood for the base of the chair. With the seat bases cut out now, the next step is to take just some regular old construction adhesive and a caulk gun here. And what I do is I just run a bead of that construction adhesive along this bottom lip here. So I'm not screwing or nailing anything in here. These will just be held in with construction adhesive, and that seems to work pretty well. I did sand the tops with 220 grit and just round the edge just a little bit with the 220 grit so that you don't have any sharp edges when you sit your butt on these things. So go ahead and use the construction adhesive and glue the plywood pieces into the base. One thing I did skip over was that although these say paint and primer, I really like to apply primer by itself. So I did 2 coats of just rattle can primer on there, hit it with some Scotch-Brite to smooth it up. I just find that you get a much better, more uniform finish instead of trying to use a paint and primer in one. So I primed it, then I glued it in. And last step is to take just a paintable caulk. And what I do is I take and just barely nip the tip on this thing here and go around and fill this little gap. So you'll, depending on how good you did with your jigsaw, you can have a really tight gap, or you might have some larger things that you have to fill. So take your time, cut a very small piece off the end of the caulk, and go ahead and fill that gap with paintable caulk. One last thing to watch for on reassembly here. So after you get your base glued in, some of the bolt holes might need to be drilled out a little bit so that you can get the nut back onto the bolt that holds these things together. So what I do is I just take a drill bit and I go on there and I nibble a little hole into the corners and wherever those bolts are coming through so that you can get the nut back on and put it back together. So there you go, finished product, all put back together again. Rattle can with the Rust-Oleum, pretty good finish on it. So yeah, comment down below. Let me know if you have any questions on how to get your crossback chairs back into shape again.